Moving on, India faces double pressure as United States President Donald Trump has approved a sanctions bill that could pave the way for tariffs up to 500% on countries purchasing Russian oil, one of them being India. As government adopts a wait-and-watch policy, Indian ambassador to the US, Vinay Quatra, has met Speaker Mike Johnson and held conversations on key areas of partnership, including defense and security, oil and gas trade, technology and more. Now, opposition in India has questioned the government, urging the Prime Minister to handle US relations with maturity, prioritizing national interest over theatrics. The tensions have also escalated with US capturing a Russian tanker with 3 Indians on board amongst other crew members. Meanwhile, interesting development, US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has now made a big claim. He has gone on to say that the trade deal could not be closed between US and India because US wanted Prime Minister Modi to call Donald Trump, which India was not comfortable with.
Sheet the contracts and set the whole deal up. But let's be clear, it's his deal.
Yeah.
Okay? He's the closer. He does the deal. So I said, you got to have Modi. It's all set up. You have to have Modi call the president. And they were uncomfortable doing it. So Modi didn't call. I had negotiated them at a higher rate. So now the problem is the deals came out at a higher rate.
Right.
And then India calls back and says, oh, okay, we're ready. I said, ready for what?
My colleague Zaka Jacob is also joining us with more on this. Zaka, this is a direct fallout of what happened during Operation Sindoor and that conversation between US and India and Donald Trump announcing the ceasefire before India could. There is so much mistrust in India that Prime Minister Modi was not willing to call the president even for the Indo-US deal.
So, basically this is that period basically in July, before the deadline of July 31st, when the reciprocal tariffs deadline was going to end. And that's where the United States in the month of July announced a number of deals, including with Southeast Asian countries like, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines. And of course, at the lower end of the tariffs were countries in the EU. The Britain, of course, had got a reprieve way back in May. And then at the higher end of that bracket was countries in Southeast Asia like Philippines, Vietnam and Indonesia, around 18-19%. So India was in that block between 15 and 20%. Lutnick says that the deal was there on the table of the president, but he wanted Prime Minister Modi to call President Donald Trump. Remember, there have been no calls between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump between June 17th, when they had this rather tense call when the Prime Minister was in Cananiscus. At that time, Trump had invited the Prime Minister to come to the White House. He was trying to bait him into having some kind of a joint meeting with Asim Munir. Asim Munir was a White House guest the very next day. So the Prime Minister avoided that. And then the next call happens on the 17th of September for the Prime Minister's birthday. So basically, there were no calls between June and September. And this is that interim period in July, just before the reciprocal tariffs deadline ended, where the deal with India was done. But Lutnick claims that in order for the I's to be dotted and the T's to be crossed, for the deal to be finally become done and delivered, it required that phone call from Prime Minister Modi to President Trump. And he claims that that phone call did not come. So officially, there is no phone call in that between June 17th and September 17th. But here's the thing. MEA is going to have a PC later on today at about 4 o'clock. They will be asked this question and they will likely give an answer to if such a thing did ever happen and if at all, what India's response to that is. But I think it's very clear. Now, what is happening is after that July 31st deadline, in the second week of August, Trump imposed the oil tariffs and now India is paying 50%, which is one of the highest in the world. In fact, the only other country other than Brazil which is paying 50% tariffs. Not even China pays 50% tariffs. Now there is a bigger worry that next week, this bill moved by US Senator Lindsey Graham, which threatens to raise the tariffs on India and China and Brazil up to 500% for import of Russian oil. So basically what Lutnick is saying is, you had a deal back then in July, you should have taken it. All it took was a phone call. That phone call never happened. Now India has been kicked back the line. Whether that applies to countries like China or Brazil, we'll have to wait and see. China, of course, has taken retaliatory action against the US and therefore they've got a reprieve for 1 year. Brazil is also in the same category as India at 50% tariffs. Now what happens is going to be the big question. I suspect that MEA will respond to Lutnick's comments and his suggestion that if the phone call had happened in July, then the deal would have been done. And now that that phone call didn't happen and now that the deal has not happened, what happens now? Is India now under the prospect of 500% tariffs, or will something happen whereby, look, ultimately, that's a bill that has to be passed in both houses of Congress. Both the Senate and the House has to pass it. And I'm not sure whether there is enough Democratic plus some Republican or independent-leaning lawmakers who might actually vote for that. Because you look at the bill that passed yesterday, sort of restraining Trump in taking any further military actions in Venezuela, 5 Republicans cross-voted. That is a huge number. So Trump will be wary, his allies like Lindsey Graham will be wary of moving such a draconian bill, such a drastic bill at a time when the president's own support on the Hill seems to be suspect, as is evidenced from yesterday's vote.
You know, but Zaga, this statement also kind of shows the dichotomy of the statements that come out from the US administration. Because, you know, just recently Donald Trump was heard saying that PM Modi said, "Sir, please call me or please meet me." Here's Howard Lutnick saying that even with the deal at stake, PM Modi was unwilling to call him. And I go back to that entire, you know, lack of trust, because Trump jumped the gun and announced that ceasefire, has been claiming credit for that ceasefire between India and Pakistan. No wonder the Indian administration doesn't want him to give another opportunity to say, "Oh, they called me and that is why I did this."
Yeah, and that's precisely why, the Prime Minister did not call between June 17th and September 17th. But here's the thing that Lutnick refuses to say. There have been multiple calls after the 17th of September. In fact, the Prime Minister spoke to President Trump when the Gaza ceasefire deal was announced. He spoke to him again in late October. There have been multiple phone calls that have happened in the time since 17th of September, and yet Lutnick does not give an answer as to why the deal has still not happened. Now it's been sort of caught in this whole quagmire of import of Russian oil. Now again, Lutnick makes this claim, and you heard Lindsey Graham also make this claim earlier, that the Indian ambassador has been saying that India has been cutting down Russian oil, but the facts on the ground speak otherwise. If you look at the data released by the Ministry of Commerce in the month of November, India imported 7.7 million tons of crude oil from Russia, which is higher than what it imported in October and in September. So it's very clear that if Trump and Lutnick and his economic team, Besant, etc., think that they can impose tariffs or threaten to impose 500% tariffs on India and hope that it changes its import of Russian oil, that's not going to work out, because ultimately India is a sovereign nation. It decides its economic and energy interests based on its own considerations. It is the 3rd largest importer of crude oil. 35% of India's crude import comes from Russia. You can't just turn that tap off overnight. Yes, private companies and public oil marketing companies have said that they will gradually reduce their dependence on Russian oil, their import of Russian oil, but it's not a tap that you can turn off overnight. And Lutnick, like I said, is being slightly disingenuous, because he's talking about a time which was 3 or 4 months ago. But what about now? Why is that deal still not happening? The only reason that deal is still not happening is because Mr. Lutnick's boss, Mr. Trump, the President of the United States, has brought in a completely invariable factor into this, saying Russian oil, and he singled out India and imposed that 50% tariff on India, even though the EU imports a lot more oil from Russia, China imports a lot more oil from Russia, and yet none of those countries have been tariffed for import of Russian oil.